Good afternoon and welcome to the Woodrow Wilson International Center for Scholars. My name is Christopher Sands and I'm director of the Canada Institute, and together with the Mexico Institute, we're very pleased to present today's discussion of North America 2.0. Earlier this year, the Wilson Center and several partner organizations joined together to put the North America 2.0 project into motion, which seeks to strengthen regional cooperation through research, analysis, and policy proposals. Today, we'll have a virtual discussion on opportunities for enhanced continental cooperation as we publish the first round of North America 2.0 policy papers on the topics of border security, migration, cybersecurity, and critical infrastructure, as well as military cooperation, higher education, and workforce development. This is just a taste of what we have planned as the three countries of North America organize for competitiveness and also security and safety in the 21st century. It's my pleasure now to hand off the discussion to the moderator of our first panel, Chapel Lawson from the Massachusetts Institute of Technology, coming to us virtually. Welcome, Chap.
Chris, thanks so much. And thanks to all of you who are attending virtually. I assume by this point in the pandemic that appetite for another Zoom meeting is relatively modest. So we're extremely grateful that you're able to come, and we promise you won't be disappointed, because if you want to learn anything about the North American Security Partnership, this is the place to be. Very grateful to Chris for that nice introduction, and also to the Wilson Center more broadly and the Belfer Center at the Kennedy School for supporting a terrific project. For those of you who haven't had a chance to read the book or the working papers that are coming out related to it, I can't recommend them enough. They're not only terrific summaries, but they move the academic debate on the future of North America forward. We're going to go through the panelists in the order that they're listing on the program, starting with Richard Sanders. You can find any information you want about the speakers and their biographies listed on the Woodrow Wilson's website, or Woodrow Wilson Center's website, or through the chat. And there are opportunities to ask questions along the way. I'm asking our speakers to stay to a relatively strict and short time limit, so that we have plenty of opportunities for interaction and for discussion. And if there are not a huge number of questions from the audience, I have a number of heretical queries for the panelists themselves. So let me turn it over to Richard.
Well, good afternoon. I want to thank the Wilson Center for letting me participate in this, and I also want to give special thanks to Alan Burson, who got me connected up with the North America 2.0 project. I've worked on Canada and Mexico in the State Department, and I'm really glad to see thinking about North America returning to the forefront a bit. If I have a thesis, my thesis is that there is an emerging security architecture for North America. Some of it has been in place for a long time, others are of more recent vintage. But they give us a basis for further cooperation among the three countries. The oldest and most elaborate structure for security cooperation is actually between the United States and Canada, and that is NORAD, the North American Air Defense Command, which is basically a joint effort to protect the skies above North America. Exists since 1958, and obviously was created to respond to the threat from the Soviet Union of a nuclear attack. However, in recent years, it has broadened its focus, particularly since the 9/11 terrorist attack, and now NORAD basically coordinates flights above North America by both Canadian and US Air Force planes to protect against a possible repeat terrorist attack. NORAD also has responsibilities for the maritime approaches to the United States and Canada. The second element of security architecture that has evolved was the creation of the United States Northern Command, or NORTHCOM. This is a unified command similar to European Command, Southern Command, Indo-Pacific Command. Joint inter-service reports directly to the Secretary of Defense and the Chairman of the Joint Chiefs. Northern Command has responsibilities for military operations inside the United States, but also security cooperation with Canada and Mexico, and actually the Bahamas as well. NORTHCOM is unique among commands in the density of its relationships with civilian agencies, and both all the law enforcement agencies, FBI, DEA, ICE, but also agencies such as the FEMA, the Federal Emergency Management Agency, and a range of state and local emergency management entities. What's also important about NORTHCOM is it has actually, at its headquarters in Colorado Springs, it has the presence of both Canadian and Mexican officers. Now, the Canadian presence is not something terribly new because of Canada's long-term involvement with NORAD, but to have Mexican officers present in a US command like this is in fact relatively novel and I think quite exciting. The third element of our emerging security architecture is the Merida Initiative, which dates from 2007. This was a joint effort by the United States and Mexico in response to the increasing threat to national security from the wealthy, powerful, and highly violent drug trafficking organizations in Mexico. Basically, it was a joint strategy backed up by significant resources from the United States, delivered through NORTHCOM in many cases. It was a hybrid strategy in the sense that it both included strengthening judicial and law enforcement agencies, but also creating a strong kinetic capability for the Mexican military to disrupt drug trafficking organizations. Mainly Mexico's Marines were involved in this. And here again, NORTHCOM has played an important role in developing capabilities. So there you have these three elements of the of security architecture. What happens next? How do we build on them? What I don't think you're going to see is the creation of a North American NATO. And I don't even think you're going to see the creation of a North American version of Europol, the European police agency. What you're likely to see is, I think, slow incremental increases in the density of our cooperation, in the range of different kinds of cooperation. I'll just tick off a couple. First, obviously, is cybersecurity. I know we have a real expert on the panel, so I'll just mention that if you think of the Colonial Pipeline crisis of this month, it could just as easily have been not this pipeline, but the Amistad Dam on the Rio Grande or the St. Lawrence Seaway. So there clearly are continental implications. I see security cooperation also increasing in light of climate change, as inevitably when there's a major climate disaster, the security forces of countries are called into play, and you may find them involved in trans-border operations or at least support. When I worked in Mexican affairs in 2005, when Hurricane Katrina struck New Orleans, actually Mexico reached out and assisted in the relief effort, including sending a couple of ships to the Gulf of Mexico, and sending a field kitchen. It was a first step, but something that was greatly appreciated, and I think is a sign of things to come. Another area for consideration is immigration. I'm sure all militaries would prefer to stay as far away from that as possible, as would many civilian agencies. But the reality has been that both in Mexico and the United States to some degree, when there's been immigration crises, the military have had at least some role. Maybe they need to talk to each other more about it. Maybe they need to think about human rights training. These ideas are at least something to consider for the future. There may be other issues, Arctic, space, etc. What I do think we can state is that structures are in place, relationships are in place, and there's a future for security cooperation among North American partners. Thank you.
Thanks, Richard. That's terrific. Before I turn it over to Luis, I just wanted to reinforce that questions can be asked of the panelists via two portals. One, Mexico at Wilson Center, all one word, .org, or through Twitter, either at Mexico Institute or at Canada Institute. And again, before I turn it over to Lisa, let me just ask you one question, Richard, which is, you didn't mention anything about equipment sourcing or military procurement or joint training. And I'm wondering if you comprehend those issues within the larger rubric of North American security, or if you think those are things that are really going to be done bilaterally or unilaterally among the three partners.
Well, as always, countries buy their own equipment or are given it. In the course of the Merida Initiative, I think 22 helicopters were provided by the United States to Mexico. Certainly, joint coordination about ways in which equipment could complement each other could be an interesting discussion. Tapping into expertise that one or another country might have. Not to mention the U.S. has a very sophisticated foreign military sales program. So yeah, I think at least talking and learning about equipment and training, some of which takes place. There probably isn't a major U.S. base that doesn't have somebody from Canada present at this point. So I think of your point is well taken.
Thank you very much, Louisa. And I think you're still muted, unfortunately.
Thank you very much. You can hear me now, Chap, right? Wonderful. Thank you, Richard. That was wonderful. And I want to be able to thank everybody who is present here today, including those who made this happen for organizing the event, launching the policy papers at the Canada Institute, the Mexico Institute, our friends, Christopher Wilson, Duncan Wood, and everybody else in Washington. Also, this wouldn't be happening if it wasn't for our mastermind project that was led by Alan Burson. And, just very briefly, how did we get here? I mean, I'm here in Mexico now. Paul is in the United States, and we have a third member of our chapter who's in Canada. And just a little bit of background very quickly. I was thinking back to when I had just finished a very intense year of a Fulbright scholarship in Washington, D.C., researching on cybersecurity in the Americas. And I thought I had finished, I was done with writing when Alan Burson reached out to me. And Alan said, Louisa, help me out. I want you to coordinate a cybersecurity chapter for our book for North America. And if any of you have ever worked with Alan Burson or Alan, I mean, you can't say no to this man. And plus, he doesn't take no for an answer. So here we are on October 1st, 2018. Paul Stockton and I were in Ottawa, Canada. Do you remember that, Paul? And, we were having dinner with Laura, Dawson, and all of the authors for the book. And suddenly, it was the USMCA agreement on that night that we were having dinner on October 1st. And it was perfect because that's when we began to talk about the future of North America as a group. Okay. And so that was the birth of this book that, eventually we will be publishing. But, just to think about North America and just to set off here a few ideas of how we went from 2018 to where we are today to 2021. We set off to interview dozens of experts in Canada, Mexico, and the United States for this policy paper. And today, well, we're starting to present some of those results, right? And when you have a chance to go through the policy paper eventually chapter, you will see that we have an underlying idea, and that is that if there is one clear example of a borderless North America, it is cyberspace. Okay, and so, we are so connected through the digital platforms in North America, and at the same time, we're extremely vulnerable to the criminal and unauthorized use of data. Okay, We focused in this policy paper on three particular things. One, protecting critical infrastructure. Okay? And Paul will be able to elaborate more on this part. Two, securing financial transactions. Okay? And this has been particularly interesting and important. We have seen how Mexico has leapfrogged, if anything good has come out of this pandemic. Mexico has leapfrogged in many ways with regards to digital financial services. The third thing we focused on was improving public, private, and regional cooperation. Okay, this is to identify and mitigate cyber attacks and also to make a more resilient cyber landscape in North America. Okay, just one piece of information that will maybe kick off the debate here today, and that is while ransomware attacks are dropping, malicious crypto mining is definitely increasing. Billions of dollars are spent by the private and public sectors to defend against these attacks every year, and here goes some statistics. The North American cybersecurity market was estimated at $51.6 billion in 2018 when we began. Today, we are projecting that cybersecurity market to increase to $82.5 billion by 2023, which is just around the corner. Okay, so I'm going to stop there and leave it for questions and answers. Thank you very much.
That's terrific, Louisa. Thank you very much. And obviously, there are a lot of people who are interested in the question of cybersecurity. But I guess one question I would ask you is to what extent, again, is cybersecurity something that really needs to be done trinationally rather than either dyadically between two of the three partners or simply in coalition with a much larger group of countries? Is there anything distinctive, perhaps the pipeline grid, about cybersecurity in North America from cybersecurity writ large?
Yes, thank you, Chap. I think the approach here is not, there's not one approach. All of the approaches are good. Bilateral cooperation, trilateral cooperation, multilateral cooperation, it's all necessary. If we look at, for example, the case of Mexico in particular, the cybersecurity challenges that Mexico faces are enormous. Mexico, I mean, also compared to Canada and the United States, we're facing here a situation where collaboration, deeper collaboration is definitely required at all levels. Mexico is the second country in Latin America to be most hit by cyber attacks, right? Brazil being number one and Peru being number three. And so, there's a great deal to do here. And I think what we focused on in particular, critical infrastructure, as we'll see in a moment, I think that's maybe one of the areas where deepening cooperation and definitely focusing on best practices at a trilateral level is definitely going to advance the security of North America. Thank you.
That's terrific. As I turn it over to Paul, let me just mention to everybody in the audience that you can now download the first round of policy papers from the website and the links are at the bottom of the event page. Oh, Paul.
Thanks, everybody. And Louisa and Chap, your discussion just now tees up my remarks perfectly, because I'd like to focus on a particular infrastructure sector that's of foundational importance on a trilateral basis, and that is energy infrastructure. And above all, the electric power grids of Canada, Mexico, and the United States. As many of you know, there are interconnections that cross our borders, the US, Canada, and Mexico, and electrons don't care whether they're Mexican, Canadian, or US electrons. They flow according to the laws of physics and not according to the laws of federal governments in any of our countries. And the question is, given this interconnected nature, how can we build our shared resilience against increasingly severe cyber threats? Mexico, Canada, the United States, each of them on their own are taking very important measures to strengthen the resilience of their power grids. And of course, companies in each of these countries are doing the same. My question to you, and what I'd like to talk about now, is what's the value proposition of having deeper trilateral cooperation? What can we do? What should we do on a trilateral basis that adds value as opposed to being in the way and a waste of time? Here's how I'd like to proceed. First of all, let's talk about some specific problems that are trilateral in nature, and then discuss initiatives, including potentially a bigger NORAD role, following along the introductory remarks that Richard made, in strengthening the shared cybersecurity of the electric systems that we know China and Russia are targeting today for disruption during future confrontations. We have the North American Electric Reliability Corporation that provides for shared cybersecurity standards of the United States, Canada, and a portion of Mexico, especially Baja California, that are subject to NERC standards. We have increasing government collaboration on a trilateral basis. But folks, I'm here to tell you, we have problems. The interconnected nature of our grid strengthens the reliability for customers in all three countries, because you can ship power from an affected area in a blackout to areas that need further assistance. You can move the power around, greater generation capacity. Transmission allows for shared response to natural or cyber incidents. But the problem is that this interconnected nature of the power grid also creates risks of cascading failures that could extend not only in regions of the United States, but across the border to Canada and Mexico. And indeed, that has happened in the past. We know that China and Russia are going to intentionally target their attacks to take advantage of risks of cascading failures and maximize the disruptive effects they'll have on public health and safety, and above all, the flow of power to critical defense facilities that they'd like to disrupt. What can we do in order to help build resilience against these kinds of threats? I'd like to suggest 3 initiatives. First of all, we need a trilateral threat assessment. The United States is not where it needs to be within our own borders of having adequate sharing of intelligence about Chinese and Russian threats, especially for operational technology systems, SCADA systems, et cetera, that adversaries are going to seek to take down to disable the functionality of the grid. A trilateral threat assessment where Mexico and Canada would share their expertise and assessments with the United States and vice versa would provide a foundation for shared approaches to strengthening grid resilience. Secondly, we need better emergency coordination. I know the United States and Canada have been making efforts for some time to strengthen a collaboration for what to do when outages strike. That's important. I'd recommend bringing Mexico further into that dialogue, but we're not where we need to be. And let me give you an example. The Secretary of Energy has authority to direct US power companies to prioritize the restoration of services to critical military bases, flow all the power they can to those military bases. If companies comply with those orders near the US-Canada border, there could be effects in Canadian service as well. And we've seen this in the grid exercises. We need closer emergency coordination, operational coordination, in the same way that we see operational coordination, Richard, that you mentioned, against our shared threat of bombers. And let's now talk about that. NORAD is playing an important role in security today. Should we consider expanding its role to contribute to the security of the North American power grid, potentially on a shared basis with Mexico as well? I think the answer is no, and here's my reasoning. Even though the threat of bombers is similar to cyber in one respect, and that is they're not just going to go after one country, right? They'll fly over Canadian airspace to get to the United States, maybe potentially to Mexico. We have a shared security challenge here that NORAD can meet on a trilateral basis. But other agencies, ARCAN, Department of Homeland Security in the United States, and above all, the Department of Energy in the United States, They have lead responsibility. They have the existing relationships with power companies. Let's not throw that away and put NORAD in charge. But I do think there's some very valuable lessons learned from NORAD that I'd be pleased to discuss during the Q&A period. And that is, how can nations maintain their sovereignty and yet achieve deep operational collaboration? Sovereignty is the sacred cow we all worship for Mexico, Canada, and the United States. Let's not do anything to dilute or compromise that, but let's seek ways of conducting operational coordination and unity of effort on a trilateral basis that draws on the lessons learned from NORAD. Thanks very much, Chap, Louisa, and all.
That was terrific. So I can't resist asking you a question about supply chains, especially for electricity companies, where equipment won't be replaced for quite some time once it's installed, and there may be embedded vulnerabilities in large portions of the network already, which could only be exacerbated by lack of attention to supply chains. So is that the sort of thing you imagine being done on a tri-national basis as well as by each country?
Absolutely.
If the electricity grids are so interconnected.
So valuable that you said that, Chap. Right now, I think we're at risk of having the United States, Canada, and Mexico go their separate ways in terms of securing their supply chains. And that doesn't make a lick of sense. There are a limited number of providers of large power transformers, protective relays, other critical components. I think given the interconnected nature of our grids, we need a shared approach to supply chain resilience that again respects the sovereignty and differing circumstances of each country, but also accounts for the fact that we are dependent on each other and we should move forward together in ways that leverage the expertise of Canada and Mexico and not have the United States go it alone.
Terrific. Jennifer, let me turn it over to you.
Thanks, Chap. Wow, that was great, Paul. Nice layup. So my background is in trucking, for those who don't know me. So I'm going to shift gears a little bit and talk a little bit about supply chain issues. But definitely was a nice layup from Paul there, talking about closer operational cooperation. And I love the comment made that we can't have Canada, the US, and Mexico going their own way to secure their supply chains, because that doesn't make a lick of sense. That transitions very nicely into my comments. So let me start just by saying, many years ago, I heard a wise person say, you know, when it comes to border security, if you want to find a needle in the haystack, the smartest way to get started is to reduce the size of the haystack. And that person was none other than Alan Burson himself. And those comments resonated with me early on in my career, because when you look at the sheer volumes of shipments, and I'm going to focus specifically on truck and land border, you know, the border agencies simply do not have and will not have the resources when it comes to people and risk assessment to find that needle. They're doing the best they can, but we have to look at creative ways to help them reduce the size of the haystack. So while my comments obviously are going to, you know, I want to take a minute and highlight the fact that we have talked about cybersecurity and how important technology is in reducing the size of that haystack and helping to find those vulnerabilities in terms of the risk assessment process. But it is my belief that the trusted trader programs, the AEO programs, particularly within North America, are really that key border management piece that need to be better leveraged. We have really not done a good job in terms of maximizing the availabilities of those programs to help us reduce the size of the haystack. Historically, if you go out and you talk to supply chain partners, trading partners, you know, there may be some resistance to joining those programs because of the perceived lack of benefits. However, others maybe disagree and say, no, I have received some benefits to belonging to those programs. At the end of the day, though, you know, the participation rates in the AEO programs in North America really haven't, they've really missed the mark. They really haven't been maximized to their full potential. And operationally, when you look at those programs, we have missed a tremendous opportunity to truly mutually recognize those programs in North America and to harmonize those programs and the way that those programs are administered. Instead of having different timeframes for different requirements for different shipments at different borders, we should, as much as possible, try to have a trusted trader framework, at least in North America, that aligns all three objectives of the countries, which is to secure the North American supply chain. Our supply chains are so integrated, and you've got companies in all three countries that want to make the efforts, that have made the efforts. And so, things like timeline requirements, application requirements, there has, now don't get me wrong, there has been some progress made in terms of Canada and the US accepting each other's, audits and verifications, but there's still so much more that needs to be done. And when you link technology with border programs like the AEO programs, there's a tremendous opportunity there to truly reduce the size of the haystack and to help those border agencies find that needle. I'll stop there.
That's terrific. So when we think about the haystack being the total flow of legitimate commerce, goods and people, and then embedded within that are some needles, which are the bad guys or the bad things, the contraband we don't want to have shipped. And often those needles are straw colored, so they're very hard to find. And if we were to torture the metaphor, I think we'd say it's not just one haystack, it's probably a whole field of haystacks per needle. So, the US-Mexico land border is supposedly the locus of extensive criminality, but only a tiny fraction, well under 0.01% of the trade is contraband in any form that goes across that border, and it's even lower in Canada. Now, you've discussed one way to reduce the problem here of finding the bad stuff within the much larger flow of good stuff, which is to blow some of the hay off the stack through trusted trader programs, but also vetted traveler programs on the people side. There's another strategy as well, which is not at all mutually exclusive, but that's to get better at finding the needle, right? And that generally goes by the jargon of targeting or law enforcement targeting, to use big data and data analytics and algorithms to identify the things that are really anomalous and potentially problematic. And often that information, especially about people, is not shared widely, nor for perfectly legitimate privacy reasons, not shared across countries. But across cargo, Jennifer, could we not do a better job at collaborating on the algorithms that would allow us to identify the bad things, as well as reducing the overall size of the haystack?
So my answer is a resounding absolutely. But I think, and I think that the work in that space needs to happen, and it needs to be prioritized, and that I'm sure is being discussed by people much smarter than I. But I think for the purposes of the conversation, and I don't want to get hung up on the details, but at the end of the day, the details are what matter to the people who are paying the freight bills, to the people who are trying to ship within North America, to the people who have these integrated supply chains, or to the small company in the middle of the US Northwest who would love to start exporting to Canada or to Mexico. The details matter. And so we can't even get the policies right. So the sharing of data, yeah, absolutely. Don't get me wrong, that is critical. And a lot of the people on this panel and the next panel will get into sort of, all of the opportunities that are available in terms of information sharing and the critical pieces related to that. But I really want to bring it down to the minutia, because I'm still talking about the same types of things that were bugaboos for industry 20 years ago when I started in this field. And that's very frustrating for someone like me, because I can appreciate when I'm on the phone with a business who wants to start exporting locally, just across the border, Ontario into Michigan. And the fact that, they can't seem to get their drivers to understand the difference between, well, if it's an hour into the US and a half an hour into Canada, or vice versa. And, an e-manifest is required coming into Canada, but it's not required heading into the United States. And, there's different fast lane access at different ports of entry, depending on where and when you're crossing. I mean, that's very frustrating. And that's an everyday practical matter that is driving up cost. It drives unpredictability, lack of transparency. And unfortunately, it's an impediment to getting companies to belong to the programs And the companies that belong to those programs, they're the key partner, they're the key ally. You have to have buy-in from them at the lowest functioning level, because if you don't build on that momentum at the low level, how are you going to get it at the highest level when it comes to data sharing? If they can't trust you to have sound policy that makes sense, why on earth are they going to give you information? So I think that we have to do a better job at trying to find a way to demonstrate to the businesses that are out there trying to do trade within North America that we hear them and that we're taking them seriously, and that we're making small efforts that aren't sexy, that don't make headlines, but really do have an impact on the everyday bottom line dollar for those trading partners.
This is perfect. So I'll exploit my prerogative as moderator here to ask a question. It'll be the same question of everybody on the panel, and maybe we can just go in reverse order, starting with Jennifer and finishing with Richard. So I'll give you each a magic wand, and you can wave it at any of the governments or all of them. And what is the thing you would change? And if it has to be more than one thing, that's okay. But just a small number of waves of the wand that are really top priority issues, and they can be very specific. You've mentioned some of the things that are most frustrating for you over the last 2 decades, Jennifer. You can pick one of those if you like. And you can also, if you prefer, pick something you would beg the governments of the region not to do, rather than simply to do, if you're afraid of something terrible happening, which can always occur with public policy. So let me go back to you, Jennifer, for the first stab at this.
Sure. I guess if I could wave my magic wand, it would be to really address the low-level fruit, that, and because the question is posed to me, Jennifer Fox, and these are pain points for me in the 20 years of my career. Those are the things I would wave a magic wand and take care of, because to me, they're easy. They're no-brainers. They're not even regulatory in most cases, or legislative. They're policy or even just operational. Very simple things that would ping off, that would take care of big headaches for North American trading partners. So for me, that's what it would be. In terms of, I guess.
So give us an example, if you would, of maybe the most outrageous or the most annoying one of these that you've encountered.
Well, we're going to run out of time if you keep going. I could talk all day about this. I mean, I guess it would probably be the basic e-manifest and trusted trader ad border requirements, which are notoriously different. So as I've already alluded to, and I don't want to beat a dead horse, but I mean, there's different requirements. There's a half-hour requirement if you're coming into the United States and you're a trusted trader for your e-manifest. If you're a trusted trader coming in to Canada, there's no e-manifest required. If you're coming into Canada and you're empty, then you do need to have an e-manifest. If you're coming into the United States and you're empty, then you don't need to have an e-manifest. So I mean, I've just given you 2 examples. That's it, just 2. And there's honestly a laundry list, chat, but we don't have time for that. But I could ping off probably, if you gave me 10 minutes, I could probably give you 10 examples. That imagine you're trying to start a trucking company, or trying to ship your products across the border, and you're trying to keep all of this straight. It's honestly, it's a little ridiculous in my opinion. And even you talk to the border agencies, and I know that they have made some efforts, but you look at the fact that the AEO programs in Canada and the US, they touted the success of one application process for both CTPAT and PIP in Canada. One application. That's only good for trucking. So that's great, but you missed the mark here. What about all the importers? I mean, and that's really who you need to target, because you can't access a fast lane unless every shipment on the truck belongs to a trusted trader. So to have a single application process for a trucking company that's hauling the freight is almost a moot point. And yet the technology exists. There's an ability to information share. They already have a shared portal. So why have we taken not even a full step? I would say a tumble, and a baby tumble at that. And yet it's a simple thing that could be done. And we have the technology. I mean, businesses are sharing this kind of information all the time. I can pay every bill I own on my cell phone, and we can't seem to have a portal for importers to apply to both programs, or even all 3 at the same time. I mean, those are the level of frustration I would get to. And I would say that it's partly because, and I'm a Canadian and I love my country, but I think that CBSA in Canada has not really done a very good job in this space. We're still looking at a pilot for RFID, and US CBP is looking at facial biometrics to clear truck drivers at the border. And this is something I've been talking about since 2002. So, we have to stop talking about the sexy issues, and we actually have to start doing some of the work. And really here in Canada, I would say, we really need to start prioritizing actually getting some of the work done, because otherwise we're going to go left behind. And you've got, 85% of the border shipments being hauled by Canadian companies. And yet the CBSA just doesn't seem to be able to move at the pace of CBP.
Which is not always a fantastic clip, by the way, to begin with. I mean, it's a relatively low bar. I don't know, this vision of the three countries not moving proposively toward rational economic integration where it makes sense, but rather staggering in that direction like a deranged toddler. It's extremely problematic. But all right, Paul, over to you for your magic wand.
Thanks, Chap. I'm not entirely sure that global warming is a Chinese plot. I think we might need to get to zero carbon power generation as fast as possible, and certainly on the timetable that President Biden has laid out. For the United States to do that, it'd be great to have increased renewable energy flows from Canada and potentially from Mexico as we look to utility scale solar and wind, and especially hydro from Canada. That's great stuff. But as we go forward towards zero carbon generation, we're at risk of creating new attack surfaces, new ways of the bad guys going after the grid. I'm going to wave my magic wand now and force the United States, as well as, if they're willing, the Canadian and Mexican governments to tackle cybersecurity as we build in the new network controls and other mechanisms that are needed to protect power resilience as we move to ideally 100% wind and solar with nuclear as an important supplement. Thank you. Oh, and hydro. Love hydro. Quebec and everybody else up there.
Yeah, you might be running out of town on a rail if you didn't mention hydro.
Yeah, no, hydro. I love hydro. Thank you.
All right, Louisa.
Thank you, Chap. I was just thinking back to, my grandma used to always say that all siblings, right, are like a hand, right? We all belong to the same hand, and yet we're all so different. Every finger is different, right? And, when it comes to Canada, the United States and Mexico, we face that same issue. And that is, it doesn't matter which finger you are on the hand, we're still part of North America. And I think that if I had that magic wand, I would definitely focus on critical cyber assets, in particular, as Paul just mentioned, the digital electricity grid. That's an easy one. I think we could, begin with that. But, the US has already identified 16 critical infrastructure sectors very clearly. Anybody can search for them. Canada, the Department of Public Safety has identified 10 sectors, and anybody can find those 10 sectors. You try and find the critical infrastructure sectors in Mexico in one place and you can't, right? So, this sibling has just got to get it together, and the important cyber strategies that have been passed in Mexico mention cybersecurity as a global concept, but there is no specific identification of the critical infrastructure sectors. And so we're blinding ourselves to focusing on a larger goal, which would be that digital electricity grid, for example. There's that tiny part, as Paul mentioned, the tiny part in Baja California, but it's so tiny that we still need to push that forward. So my magic wand would go towards, hey, get it together. We belong to the same hand,
That's great. Richard?
Well, a lot of the discussion has been very operational, as it should be, whether you're talking about trucks crossing the border or electrons. But I think if we want to make sustained progress, we need to have an impulse at the political level for these things to kind of move forward at the pace we want. In the past, we had the North America Defense Ministerial, which the Secretary of Defense and his Canadian and Mexican counterparts would meet. I'd like to see that revived. It kind of has fallen off in recent years. Maybe we should also bring in the Secretary of Homeland Security. Maybe this, I'm been convinced now the Secretary of Energy might have a role, obviously with their Canadian and Mexican partners, because our bureaucracies are all kind of like like the dinosaurs. It takes 5 minutes from the thought to make it from the head to the tail, and we simply need to energize the kind of the institutions that make these decisions. So if I had a wish, it would give us some political top cover on these issues.
That's great. I mean, I guess if I were to answer my own question along the lines of what Richard said, we seem to still somehow be lacking the structures under USMCA to drive forward at the operational level all these things. And my memory from when I was in government was that there were these structures in place, and I'm not sure why they're not working to have the sorts of effects that you all mentioned. For instance, as you said, Jennifer, I'm not sure why there isn't continuous progress between the border management agencies that will rectify these situations, or alternatively, progress between parliamentarians on both sides of the border in the north. So what's the institutional obstacle there that you see? I'm constraining your use of the magic wand here, but I'm just thinking, if you were to design something that would ensure this kind of continuous progress, what would it look like?
One idea that has been out there always is, do you create some kind of North American secretariat or some kind of entity, whether it's tied to the NSC or the State Department in Washington, the Privy Council, or the Foreign Ministry in Canada, the Presidency in Mexico, that kind of creates institutional memory, that does reporting, that basically kind of keeps your eye on the ball as much as possible. That's how you make things happen. Is you have deadlines and groups and subgroups and all that painful bureaucratic apparatus that you need to do policy work.
I mean, I used to think that what we call in the United States the presidential summits, they could involve a prime minister in the case of Canada as well, and then the ministerial level meetings were those action forcing events. And that certainly was the case under the Clinton administration, early after NAFTA was approved. I don't know, I guess I haven't been in government recently enough in the last 5 years to know whether those institutions are ineffectual or moribund, and whether we need to create a new sort of mechanism of the type Richard outlined. But Jennifer, what do you think is needed to really make continuous progress on all the sources of tremendous irritation you've experienced over the last 2 decades?
Well, you know what, Chap, I wish I had an answer for you. I think, unfortunately, to Richard's point, a lot of it comes down to political will. I know that the Beyond the Border Action Plan wasn't necessarily, the be all end all for everyone that's listening, but it was the first real plan that we had that had top level buy-in, and industry was excited, and pilots happened. We made progress. And I mean, it wasn't all good. Some of the pilots were, not very well operationalized and not very well run and not very well thought through, but we did them, and they happened. And there was accountability and there was timelines. And then a change at the political level in Canada and in the United States, and poof, it's gone. And so industry is left to pick up the pieces and to try and muddle through. And, and Jerry Bruno and Matt Morrison have done a really good job putting together the Beyond the Borders, Beyond Pre-Clearance Action Plan that is now the Future Borders Coalition. So kudos to them. And that was essentially born out of the Beyond the Border Action Plan to say, hey, us as industry are not okay with this just kind of disappearing. This is the first real action plan that we've seen, and we need to keep the government feet to the fire and say, this is important work. And yet, so here we are again, and Future Borders Coalition is doing a lot of good work and have a tremendous amount of allies, a lot of whom are on this call today, to move that work forward. And government is there, but it's not being led by government. It's not being championed by government. Getting government buy-in is, again, a challenge. And unless you've got that top-down approach, what happens politically when the next election happens, whether there's an appetite to actually do something about the 49th, whether it's land, air, rail, marine, it doesn't matter. Unless there's a political appetite to do something with this work, it will be industry once again trying to muddle through and get government support and get the bureaucrats at the table and start talking about it again and all the things that need to happen. So I don't have an answer, because I think until we have some leadership at the highest level that says this is really important, not just to Canada, not just to US, not just to Mexico, but to North America, so that we can compete globally, we need to prioritize this. And that becomes a consistent way of thinking regardless of political party. I think we're always going to be reinventing the wheel, sadly.
That's great. I want to just remind everyone in the audience that you can mail questions by email to mexico@wilsoncenter.org, or feed them to us via Twitter at Mexico Institute or at Canada Institute. We do have one from that I really wanted to highlight, and it's a challenging one from the perspective of security integration. And I think it's phrased as specific to Mexico, but the gist of the question is, if we are to have a more collaborative system for information sharing, and I assume for response protocols based on information sharing when it comes to counter cartel activity or some other shared law enforcement action along mutually beneficial lines. How do we reconcile the challenges that we've seen in Mexico on issues of professional integrity in law enforcement? I should just mention, that's the question. These issues aren't at all confined to Mexico. They certainly exist in US agencies as well. And I assume at some level they exist in Canadian agencies, but conventionally at least, the challenge in Mexico has been called out much more commonly and vociferously. So for those of you who are on the panel want to take a swing at this, how would you reconcile this tension? That is the need to do more collaboratively with Mexico, with the challenge of professional integrity in the law enforcement apparatus.
Can I give it a shot, chap? Thank you. Thank you. It's a tough question. It's a very good question. And I think it's an ongoing debate here in Mexico and other countries. But definitely, I think you, Jennifer, Paul, Richard, you've all mentioned it. And that is the political will, first of all. There's got to be that political will. There has to be that regional cooperation. And it begins, with policy that allows for a certain framework to operate within each nation. So regional cooperation, but that political will, I think is fundamental. After that, I think it has a lot to do with also public and private collaboration. And here we cannot undermine the power of civil society. So we've got to focus on civilians as well, who are part of this, who are part of helping to identify and mitigate these cyber attacks in what we have focused on. But security in general is not it's not a one-person show. It really brings in the political will of governments, and it brings in civil society, it brings in academia, it brings in all the NGOs. There's got to be something here that is larger than one entity only. So I think that in the case of Mexico, at least, that's the goal, that's the idea, to be able to improve those public-private cooperation issues, along with the political will of policy.
See, to me, I think there's a little bit of a bugaboo here, because it is true that, and I don't want to minimize the problems of engaging in counter cartel operations in Mexico, but there are ways of sharing information with vetted and sequestered units that don't taint operational efficacy. And so I again, not meaning to minimize the problem, I think this is often held up as a reason for not sharing information. That it doesn't have to be. There are adequate workarounds. And I guess I would say the same thing in a different way when it comes to counterterrorism operation and maybe counter transnational crime operation with Canada. The Canadian government has, I won't say fetish because I think it's totally appropriate and legitimate, but has very strong privacy protections and concerns about sharing information with the United States on particular individuals, including individuals who are legal residents of Canada. But there are, again, legitimate workarounds within totally compatible with charter rights. So I hear these complaints a lot, but my own personal reaction is skepticism, and to think that there are plenty of ways we can engage in real information sharing within North America as trusted partners to minimize the effects of transnational crime or beef up counterterrorism efforts. I don't know if anybody else wanted to jump in on this same question, or
if I would just to say first, I agree with what you're saying. The problems are real, but at the same time, you work with what you got. Not all law enforcement agencies are the same in a country. Not all military services are the same. Some are more capable partners. Some are more willing partners than others. There have been successful operations, and it's a long-term concern. But I would agree, you can't just throw your hands up and say we can't do anything. Or you take it as far as you can while being conscious of your own security needs.
Let me add, Chap, very briefly that we don't want to be shooting behind the target here. I realize that the cartels and organized crime, that's a clear and present danger, but a growing number of power companies in the United States, Canada, and potentially Mexico are ramping up their efforts to deal with insider threats. It's not enough to go after traditional cybersecurity. We need to understand that adversaries will attempt to penetrate the control rooms of electric utilities. That's the new front that we need to anticipate. And again, reason to have trilateral collaboration and to have a shared trilateral threat assessment on these insider threats.
It seems like there's a lot of appetite for questions of cybersecurity. So I will play my role as an academic and throw out the outrageous suggestion for others to react to. It strikes me that when it comes to cybersecurity, there's this broad attack space, but the actual public interest is rather narrow, and it's confined to the sorts of problems that could lead to cascading failures in critical infrastructures. And the types of entities that are most likely to produce those sorts of systemic attacks on infrastructure are really rival nation states. There may be some other groups, but they're probably not terrorists, and they're probably not hackers, and probably not even cyber criminals, despite the recent attacks on pipelines. I think it's really this question of pooling government and industry resources to create true integration of effort in dealing with attacks from rival nation states that have high level of capability in this realm. And it's not all 16 sectors. It's really probably only 3 or 4 of them, and a couple of other subsectors that should really concern us. And within those sectors, it's not all firms. Realistically, it's only probably 20 or 50 firms in the United States that would need to be brought together in a war room with representatives of the government, the intelligence community, Department of Homeland Security, and Cyber Command, all in the same operating environment, which would provide eyes on privately owned systems and the ability to knit together bits of information to determine when an attack was happening. Because otherwise that information is distributed across public and private networks, and then to respond accordingly. So this is sort of the idea behind Project Indigo, for which the FSARC financial services entity under the FS-ISAC was operating. And now that has been renamed the ARC because it's going to include companies in the United States outside of simply the financial services, including, say, electricity. But why would we not also want certain Canadian and Mexican partnership involvement in that kind of partnership, so that there was a real operational basis to the collaboration in the face of potential threats or attacks from rival nation states.
Chap, I want to say, we want to invite everyone to read our policy paper because we elaborate a proposal there. And I'm just going to mention briefly that yes, we did discuss that as a team when we were writing up this policy paper, future chapter. And, definitely we had some very difficult discussions because, on the one hand, Canada was, our Canadian partner, Bull was saying, well, this would never pass in Canada. And, Paul was saying, come on, we got to try and work something out that can be tri-national. Mexico also, when we interviewed our experts on security here in Mexico with regards to defense in particular, it was a really thorny issue. And so we came up with an example that you can see in the policy paper. And the example, I would like to hand that over to Paul now because, it was his idea. He said, how about if we do this? And then we use the Canada model. So Paul, do you want to elaborate further on what we did in our paper there?
Louisa, I think you've just done so. That perfectly captured both the value proposition and the way ahead. And Chap, going back to something Jennifer said earlier, you've just made our pile of straw smaller, which is the goal. Let's figure out what has the greatest systemic risk, what really matters to the people of Mexico, Canada, and the United States and our respective economies, and focus on those potentially catastrophic risks, because that's where the greatest return on investment is going to happen. And in some cases where I think collaboration is going to be easier because the potential risks to all three nations are immense in ways that, Jennifer, your problem set is more difficult because it's just trucks going across the border, right? It's not the end of civilized life as we know it and the outbreak of cannibalism or whatever your fantasy is if we lose all electric service. So I think there is a way forward, and Louisa, you captured it perfectly.
So I see that nobody's taken me up yet on my proposal to wave a magic wand at stopping governments from doing something that they might otherwise do terribly wrong. And, governments do great things. Governments can also make awful mistakes. One that comes to mind is blocking proposals for new private infrastructure in the Detroit, Windsor area. That historically has been a sort of regulatory hurdle. I can think of other things though that governments might do wrong, and I don't know if there's anything on you all's list that's worth mentioning here. Things that you would beg, for instance, the Biden administration not to do.
I'll jump in. Can you hear me okay?
Yep.
Okay, great. It's not so much something that's being done that I think needs to stop. I think it's something that, at least to my knowledge, is not happening that needs to happen. And it kind of fits that bill. And it's a lack of intrinsic knowledge management within the bureaucracies that make the decisions, that inform the policy, that shape the things that we're talking about today. So, for instance, you have a lifelong public servant who has, pretty much been working in, say, a particular space and has had extensive dialogue and consultations with stakeholders and associations and on all three sides of the North American border, and has this wealth of knowledge that you really can't, you just can't articulate, right? You can't really, there's no book out there that's going to teach this. And I think that at the bureaucratic level anyway, I won't speak politically, but at the bureaucratic level, we don't do a very good job capturing that knowledge and passing that knowledge on. And so what happens, of course, invariably, is that person leaves, they get scooped up to another department, or they retire, or who knows, any number of things could happen. And that knowledge, poof, gone. It's just gone. It goes with them. And I don't think that we have done a good job of having an embedded knowledge management system into the bureaucratic function of government to help inform policy. And that is something I would say to government, please stop making policy without having informed knowledge at your fingertips. And I had a great discussion the other day with Marta from the Cross Border Institute. I'm sure many of you know, we talked about this, the lack of intrinsic knowledge management within government, and how to get that gap at least smaller, because it's a huge beast. So there's no way you're going to be able to educate every government individual on everything that they need to know in terms of policy, but maybe starting with a small scope, such as, because it's me talking, I'll talk about trucks, such as trucks that are crossing the border. How to inform the people at the CBSA and others in other government departments that are making policy decisions on trucks at the border. It could be Transport Canada, could be public safety. It doesn't necessarily have to be CBSA. There are other government departments involved with the movement of goods at the border. How do you get them to a place where they understand some of the conversations that have already been had for the last 20, 30, 40, 50 years about what needs to happen, what the priorities are for stakeholders, how this makes sense, what the operational nuances are. And really what I'm talking about could be really translated into any sector. It doesn't have to be trucks at the border, but capturing that institutional knowledge, I think, is a big gap that needs to be filled before we start just, again, implementing policies, particularly at the border.
I worry that we're agreeing too much with each other. So I will attempt to make another statement that I thought was heretical, but maybe people will agree with. And that's, one of the problems with the original, if you will, 1.0 North America vision was it seemed to become a catch-all for pet policy projects that weren't necessarily scoped properly for a tri-national environment. That really they were problems that could be handled by one country within its own borders or bilaterally. And so what would you all say to skeptics of the idea of a reformed vision of North America 2.0, that is focused more on explicitly identifying the elements of cooperation that really need to be done either dual bilaterally or tri-nationally? What would you say to the skeptics who said, yeah, really, there's not much there when you get down to it on security at the tri-national level? I mean, all of you have mentioned specific things, but that security remains one of these domains where the US-Canada relationship is just so much tighter than the US-Mexico relationship or the Mexico-Canada relationship that it doesn't really make sense to talk tri-nationally. Or alternatively, that we have two land borders, not three, and it really makes sense to think of those things as two bilateral agendas rather than a single tri-national agenda. So push back on this skepticism and tell me what you see that's really tri-national and North American in the security agenda. I'll go to Richard first because he already mentioned several things. But
first I'd say there's, you raise a genuine issue. I mean, the geography has its own sort of realities. Canada and Mexico don't have a common border. There's tremendous asymmetries in the size and the levels of economic development of these countries. It's not like the beginning of the European, the European community where they had 5 countries that, were not that different in size and population. So yeah, it's always gone. It is an uphill battle in some ways, but at the same time, we have how many years of NAFTA USMCA do we have? Integration at a lot of levels is a reality. We're now talking, on the economic side, the big thing happening is purchased by Canadian National of Kansas City Southern, which basically will mean a single railroad from Canada to Mexico. Reality, and then that of course is a piece of infrastructure that all these security issues are relevant to. So you can always say it's not necessary, but you have to kind of look at it piece by piece and say, well, if trucks and trains and electrons are moving across all three borders, then a purely bilateral approach really is not enough. At the same time, you probably have to sell it to people, and that's a big issue. I think is that North Americanness is not. I don't think it ever penetrated into the broader public. It was a matter for bureaucrats and academics and think tanks and things like that, and how you get a bigger public discussion or a sense of it going is I think a challenge as we move forward.
We have 10 minutes left, and we've got a couple questions that I wanted to make sure people got to. One is regarding, I think, the same issue in the guise of a North American security perimeter. Is there any value in using that term, or does it just freak people out too much and imply loss of sovereignty unnecessarily that becomes then its own obstacle to making progress on the issues we really care about? Should we be thinking in terms of something like a security perimeter, or should we banish that kind of jargon from our vocabulary? I want to ask Paul.
My pleasure. Well, defending and protecting the sovereignty of each of our three countries is a no-brainer. Must do that. That's the starting point going forward. But as I said briefly before, and I'd be interested in thoughts from Tony and Richard and others, we've got a model in the case of NORAD where the two nations have jealously guarded their sovereignty and achieved deep operational integration and unity of effort. We've been able to square the circle with a defense alliance that is unequaled around the planet. It's very special. It deserves protection. I think discussions need to go forward further than they have thus far, and including Mexico in ways that Mexico would find beneficial. But I think the idea of defensive perimeter, chap, it's old think. It's ways of imagining kinetic and nuclear warfare being extended into the future. That's only part of the challenge in the cyber and above all in the information era. And anybody who thinks that China or Russia is going to attack us with cyber weapons against the grid without also conducting information warfare to inflame public panic and fear and coerce leadership decision-making. If you don't think that's going to happen, you're smoking the strong stuff. Get with it. We are in the realm of information warfare. We need shared defenses against that as well as malware. None of these things look like bear bombers flying over Canadian airspace to get to Washington, D.C.
So this is great. So let me go around again and just give everybody the opportunity to make some closing comments. And we're going to finish with Louisa and give her the last word. But now I'll turn to Jennifer and then Richard and then Paul first. So if there's anything you want to make sure that hasn't come up yet, you want to make sure the audience hears, this is the opportunity.
I just want to ask Paul if his reference to a bunch of people smoking the strong stuff is the Canadians, friends up north here.
Well, we admire your leadership in that as well as many other areas of progress.
Yeah, so listen, I guess just for my closing remarks, I'll end on that last point that you had asked there, Chap, about North America versus Canada, US, Mexico. When just recently, we had some labor dispute issues with the Port of Montreal here in Canada. And where do you think that those ships started going when they weren't coming into the Port of Montreal? They went to the US, and those goods got onto a rail car or a truck, and they crossed up here into Canada or went down into Mexico. Every Canadian truck that crosses the US border invariably is going to turn around and come back. Every Mexican truck that's crossing the US border is going to turn around and go back. Every train is they're crossing the border in and out of these countries. So if we think that we are protecting our sovereignty by building up walls with respect to these invisible borders, we are not doing that. We are creating invisible impediments to efficiency within our own continent, and it just doesn't make sense. And it used to drive me crazy having conversations with Canadian bureaucrats who would say, no, we can't do it the same as US Customs. We have to be a sovereign nation. We are a sovereign nation, but we are an integrated supply chain with our partners in the US and in Mexico. And the more that we are different, the more inefficient we are. There are other ways that we can be sovereign. You can call a program whatever you want, and you can paint it red and white and put a maple leaf on it, whatever we need to do. But the way that that program is administered, the policies, the operational elements of these things that we are trying to fix need to be harmonized, because my answer would be we're already harmonized. North America already exists. So to have a conversation about doing it differently because it protects us somehow from that sovereign perspective, I think doesn't make sense. And I'll end with that. Enough of my soapbox for today. Thank you. Thank you for the opportunity to be here.
That's great, Richard.
Okay. I think we should avoid terribly provocative terms, and I think probably North American defense perimeter has become one. North America 1.0 to some degree foundered on, people that were worried about black helicopters or whatever. I think, if you talk to people about pragmatic things that could affect their lives, like power blackouts, you talk to businessmen about increased or decreased costs in transporting your goods. You talk about jobs. You can create interest, whether it's in the business community, the general public, politicians. I think we do need a dialogue at all sorts of levels, but it's got to be on what works. Those systems that have worked, like NORAD, I think kind of sell themselves over time. But we need to be cool and matter of fact, and build on what we've got.
Along with security perimeter, we can relegate, I hope, to the dustbin of rhetoric, things like NAFTA superhighway, the Amero trinational currency, any talk of a customs union, and things along those lines. Because I honestly agree with you, Richard, that they did help to significantly hobble the original version of North America, when there is so much important stuff to be done that really does affect the everyday lives of people living in all three countries. Paul?
I want to take a moment to thank Alan Burson, Chris Wilson, Laura Dawson, and you, Chap, everybody who's been making it possible for us to have this dialogue today, to churn out what I think is a terrific publication, and to have a basis for progress going forward for many years to come. Thanks to all of you. And special thanks, Louisa, to you for being such a great partner in crime.
Shall I wrap up, Chap?
Please, and then I'm just going to turn it over to the next panel, and also
Absolutely.
I will briefly engage in the exercise of channeling Alan Burson, who's clearly the intellectual progenitor and mobilizing force of this effort, but please go ahead.
Thank you, Chap. You were so kind, because 5 minutes ago there was this massive storm and you wouldn't have heard anything I said. So thanks for letting me go last here. I want to echo what Paul has said. You know, we've been doing this for 3 years now, Paul. Okay, we've been working back and forth, Canada, Mexico, the United States, on the issue of cybersecurity in North America. I actually think that Alan Burson approached me because I'm an international, or I'm actually a North American by default. I grew up in Canada, Jennifer, so I know where you're coming from. I studied in the United States and spent a great deal of time in the United States, but I now live in Mexico. And, you know, being able to see the 3 North American nations from a holistic perspective allows me to, you know, I actually have a very positive outlook, chap. So my vision is, of course, that yes, we can work together. And yes, we do live in a borderless North America in many ways already, because we are already interdependent in infrastructure and supply chains and in so many ways, right? So I think that we have to push forward on that level and not on separation or our differences. Let's focus on what we're good at together. So thank you very much.
That's a terrific way to conclude. My gratitude to all of those who are on the panel, to the audience, and to the people behind the scenes at the Canada Institute, the Mexico Institute, and the Wilson Center, as well as to our partners at the Balfour Center at Harvard, for a terrific event. We're moving on to the second panel, but as we do, I should just once again call out Alan Burson's name has been taken in vain many times, but he really is the driving force behind this new vision of North America 2.0, in which so many of these crucially important ideas are coming to the fore from the contributors to this volume. There were a number of questions from the audience before I turn it over to Chris Sands for the second panel about where to access the papers for this panel. And if you just go to the event website, you'll be able to download them there and read in more detail about the sorts of points that our panelists made. So thanks to everybody. And on my own behalf, very grateful to have been included.
That was
Excellent.
great. Chris, you gonna segue to me, or do you want me to just jump in?
You know, I'm going to segue to you only because Chap's shout out got me to suddenly say, oh my gosh, I'm on camera, so I better get back in. So it's with great pleasure that I segue to Laura Dawson. She segued the Canada Institute to me a little more than a year ago. I've tried not to break it, but I am really grateful that she's still involved with us. And I'm afraid you'll decide once you've listened to her that the Canada Institute's had a downgrade, certainly in coolness, but having her as part of this dialogue, I think, is really important as we look at the second panel at some of the issues that may come up for North America 2.0. Laura, over to you.
Thank you so much, Chris. I don't know about the coolness factor, although you've got me wishing we actually did have segues, like the mall cop kind of segues where we could do a little tour. I'm afraid the only thing I have to wave the flag with is I do have a throw pillow on the spare bed behind me. So if you can see the maple leaf and the stars and stripes reclining together. No comments about strange bedfellows. Thanks for the great introduction, Chris. As people have mentioned, I'm Laura Dawson. I was involved with the North America 2.0 project at the creation. As everyone else has said, it's all because of Alan Burson. He's the wind beneath our wings. I have moved on to the Amazon Web Services Institute. So I'm running a think tank within Amazon Web Services, the cloud provider that many of you know, and even more of you, if you don't know it, you use it. They have asked me to say that anything that I say here today is my own opinion and do not reflect the views of my employer. So there's my standard disclaimer done. And now let's jump back into the fun stuff. Although, Paul, we won't be smoking any of the strong stuff. That was that may be good for your security people, but here where we do workforce development and education, it's a movement of people. It's all seriousness all the time. I have been a proponent and a promoter of the North American relationship since before there was a North American relationship. I did my PhD thesis with Simon Reisman, one of the original negotiators of the Canada-US Free Trade Agreement. And from that day to this, I continue to be a cheerleader for the relationship, a promoter, a bridge builder whenever I can be. And I think one of the challenging areas in this North American relationship is this area of education, labor mobility, and workforce development. I mean, I really empathize with all of the points that Jennifer made about how difficult it is to move a truck across the border, but trade is easy compared to movement of people. And I remember when we first got that labor mobility chapter in the NAFTA in 1994, I was like, hey, look what we got. Isn't this terrific? Free movement of people and recognition of professions. And when you talk to an actual government official or negotiator or regulator, they would look at you with that, what we say here in Atlanta, that bless your heart look. Aren't you cute? Aren't you special to think that you could actually get movement of people freely and effectively with just that one little trade agreement? So as we have discovered, the devil is in the details, and it is one of the least developed, but I think most ripe for development areas of North American cooperation. Yes, one of Chap Lawson's favorite expressions too. Bless your heart. So you don't need to hear from me because I'm the glue between a bunch of smart people. And so as Chap followed the model of having folks provide a 5-minute overview of their chapter findings, I'm going to do exactly the same thing. I'm going to look to you, the audience, to provide us with some questions. I'm going to make one request in that, despite working for a high-tech company, I am actually doing this on my iPhone because my company laptop is not really talking to the program that Wilson Center is using today. So can I ask Olivia or Jackie, as you are collecting questions, if you are collecting questions, can you give me a verbal cue and say, hey, Laura, we got a question? Because if there's chat to see or side channels to read, I'm not going to be able to read them. So somebody else, please, give me a verbal hand wave if there's questions or anything else I should be paying attention to. Okay, so on to our learned panel. Again, I'm not going to read the bios. You have those available to you. But joining me today, I have Fernando Leon Garcia, the president of CETIS University. And when Fernando speaks, he's going to tell you what CETIS University is. I have Ambassador Tony Wayne, public policy fellow and advisory board co-chair for the Mexico Institute. One of my dear former colleagues, and another dear former colleague, Andrew Seeley, who is president of the Migration Policy Institute and advisory board member for the Mexico Institute. So, gentlemen, welcome. It is my great pleasure to spend the next hour or so with you talking about these important issues. What I'm going to do is I'm going to ask each of you to give some main findings from your chapter. We're going to go in the order that we are in the program. So Fernando, Tony, Andrew. I will hit you with one hopefully good question after your presentation before we move on to the next person. And then we'll move into kind of a round robin discussion in which I'll be asking some more questions and initiating a little bit more discussion between and among the three areas of expertise. So I am going to hope that everyone is here and plugged in and they've got their camera on and their microphone on. And I am going to throw the trilateral ball first to Fernando Leon Garcia from CETIS University. Good afternoon, Fernando.
Good afternoon, Laura. Thank you very much. And I guess everybody has been talking about Alan Bursey. Same thing here. So have to appreciate the role of Alan Bursey in trying to put together something concerning higher education. Also, Christopher Wilson. It's a pleasure to be here on this panel with Tony Wayne and Andrew Seeley. Regarding CETIS University, Centro de Enseñanza Técnica y Superior, in short, CETIS University, institution located in BC, as I was joking with Laura. It's not British Columbia, it's Baja California, Mexico. So, but in any case, heavily involved in different positions, different institutions since the 90s, and in particular with CONAHEC, Consortium for North American Higher Education, which was created as a result of the trilateral interaction between the three countries. I'd like to acknowledge that the remarks I'm going to try to share include extensive involvement on the part of the University of Texas San Antonio president, Taylor Ime, the president of University of British Columbia, Santa Ono, and the former undersecretary to the US for North American Affairs from Mexico, excuse me, Sergio Alcocer. In the process, as we were sharing some of the ideas, we also received some feedback, among others from US Ambassador to Mexico, Christopher Landau, Canadian Ambassador to Mexico, Graeme Clark, and the Undersecretary of Education, Luciano Concheiro. So I think there's been a lot of feedback, and I'll try to just touch upon several items that the article includes. I think first and foremost, there are key events that relate to how the collaboration in terms of higher education has evolved over the years. Key among these would be the event in Racine, Wisconsin, the Wingspread Conference. Key also was the Vancouver Symposium. Both, one followed the other. And then the other would be the Calgary Communique. All of these try to bring together the higher education players, the different higher education players, to try to espouse collaboration, look at programs to enable faculty and administrators from the three countries, try to develop trilateral collaborative activities that, of course, and naturally included a lot of focus in terms of the students. But since then, and Ambassador Wayne will probably discuss this, there were also issues pertaining to mobility of professionals across borders, portability and certification of skills. So since then, there has been this discussion. I think that overall, what we can say in terms of what happened was that you can talk about two stages. One is the first 20 years. The next would be 2014 to the present, and then some prospective considerations. I think that in terms of the snapshot, what we could say is that the coming together of the different parties did in fact promote more collaboration than existed before. What you had before was some isolated collaboration that was bilateral. Canada, Mexico, Mexico, US, US, Canada, but not trilateral. So all of a sudden, there was a lot of effervescence in terms of collaboration. And while the ideal did not happen, there was an increase overall in activities. We have not yet been able to resemble, but then the bases are different in terms of the European Union and what has been done then. We do relate also to more recent activities, such as the 100,000 Strong for the Americas, POBESI, in the case of an initiative from Mexico, both of which were more bilateral in nature, but that did achieve some progress. In the case of the 100 Strong for the Americas, for example, something that is distinctive is that it did garner support from private enterprise. ExxonMobil, Santander, Coca-Cola, MetLife, Sempra Energy, Televisa, Chevron, among others. And so while there has been overall increase, I think that similarities and differences continue to exist, such that now as we're facing the launch or the implementation of USMCA, CUSMA, according to Canada, TEMEC, according to Mexico, there are definitely some areas of opportunity. I think that as part of the work, we identified some potential issues that we could focus on that are common across the countries. On the one hand, you have inclusion, diversity, and access as one, innovation as other, competitiveness and enhancement of skills as another, impact overall in terms of the economy and society, and also the incorporation of the SDG or Sustainable Development Goals. I will close, although I'm a little bit beyond the 5-minute mark, with 5 specific proposals. I won't belabor, I'll just mention them, Laura. Number 1, convene an initial North American Higher Education Summit that eventually can become a recurring periodic summit. Number 2, create trilateral initiatives that build upon the network of FOBESI, BESI in terms of bilateral, Proyecta 100,000 strong, and other initiatives so that we could consider something like perhaps FOTESI as trilateral. Involve heads of states and relevant ministries from all 3 governments, essential. Convene and secure the involvement of senior executives and representatives of Fortune 500 companies with presence on key clusters across North America, and promote greater awareness of North American higher education plans and progress by partnering and systematically communicating with recognized media outlets, for example, Chronicle of Higher Education, Inside Higher Education, etc. So I'll cut it short here so that our fellow panelists can also convey their remarks. Thank you. You are muted, Laura.
I know it's because the big giant hand in the sky is muting me. I'm not going to let you off so easily, Fernando. I want to ask you one question to start with before moving on to Tony. We have been working on these reports. You and your team have been working on these reports over a number of months, some people years. We have just had a rather cataclysmic global event with the COVID-19 pandemic. To what extent do you think that the pandemic has changed the face of higher education? And of these changes, what do you think are the lasting changes that we will see continued into the future once, fingers crossed, we're into a recovery mode?
Well, I think that what the pandemic did on the one hand was to bring to the table and bring up front issues that we were debating with, but were fearful or timid or shy about embarking on them. One specific one relates to the use of technology in higher education. In fact, back in 91, 92, that was one of the proposals, to establish NADERN, North American Distance Education and Research Network. It hasn't happened, but I think the pandemic has forced us to collaborate broadly, not only within a country, but globally, and of course, as part of the bloc. So I think that this is one of the areas where it has definitely pushed or moved the needle. Second is that there's a broadening in the concept of internationalization. All institutions, because of the pandemic, are now looking forward at strategic alliances. They are all looking forward at establishing virtual or e-mobility possibilities, not in replacement of, but in expansion and enhancements of what we have done in terms of internationalization. Internationalization at home, which means bring the world to each of your universities. Technology has allowed that. And just 2 other comments, or many more, but just 2 other comments, I think, as a result of the pandemic. The potential emergence of the borderless professor and the potential emergence of the borderless degree. And I'll leave it at that.
Thank you. And we will come back to that because we know, I'm a big fan of technologies that enable collaboration across borders, and every one of us is probably collaborating with team members, colleagues in other countries, but getting your certificate recognized, getting your credentials recognized, getting yourself taxed in the right territory, etc. This is where we are all challenged to make it a truly cross-border collaboration and cooperation and remote work, etc. So we are going to come back to that. But now I'm going to ask Ambassador Tony Wayne to talk to us a little bit about his work on workforce development and the major findings from the chapter that you worked on, Tony.
Thanks very much, Laura. And thank you, Fernando, for talking about some things also very close to my heart and closely related to workforce development. It's hard to separate skills training, reskilling, the right kind of education you need broadly for work from the kind of education that's available in the various forms of secondary and higher education, technical schools or community colleges and full-scale universities. So I started looking at the workforce development issue from trying to understand why there was so much animosity toward trade in North America. And what I was led to was really to look at the effects that technological changes, not trade, but technological changes had in workplaces, and how none of the three governments in North America were really dealing with these implications for their workforces, for their workers, very effectively. And so that led me to look at the importance of having a dialogue on workforce development, first of all, within each of the three countries, and secondly, across North America, understanding that there was not much of a dialogue going on now. So even before the pandemic, it was quite clear that there were very worrisome skills gaps and mismatches in each of the three countries, and they showed up regularly in the studies that were done about employers trying to find the right people for jobs and employees or potential employees trying to find jobs and to get the skills training they needed to get those jobs. And then what's happened during the pandemic is that the pandemic has exacerbated all sorts of these challenges and just made it really harder for both companies and workers to adapt, of course. And the real risk is for the workers that they're left behind, and for the companies and the economies, North America, that they're left behind relatively in this global competition with China and others to be one of the most efficient, productive, and prosperity generating economic regions in the world. So we started looking into this, and Sergio Alcocer has joined me in this study that we've done to see, well, what's really needed here? What kind of things should we be looking at? And what we discovered was that, somewhat consistent with the recommendations on the education sector, is there really needs to be a set of dialogues that go on and mechanisms for dialogue that go on and for mutual learning across North America. And we discovered that there were really a whole bunch of different important parts of that, but that it came down to four key areas we thought should be talked about. One is work-based learning. One is the item that Laura mentioned, credentials and transparency and portability. The other one is really just understanding what's happening in the marketplace, having transparency for the data in the labor marketplace so you could identify emerging jobs and skills that were needed. And then to have collaborative mechanisms so that governments, the private sector, education institutions could work together effectively to get ready for what's coming. And that's just not happening right now, really, in any of the three countries, except in certain regional areas where there is good collaboration and good partnerships that have gone on. And so we can come back and talk about that. But let me say a little bit about what Laura was just raising. What about the effect of the pandemic? So it seems that what the pandemic really has done is it has accelerated the number of workers that are likely going to have to switch their occupations over this decade. Before the pandemic struck, McKinsey had already, and others had done study, but McKinsey had done a study, and they'd estimated that probably 54 million US workers and about 7 million Mexican workers were going to have to change jobs by 2030. Their new study that just came out a couple of months ago only looked at the United States and some other countries, not Mexico, but in the United States and other places, it said that that number of workers is now quite likely to be higher. And that the workers who are going to be really hurt by this are low-wage workers, workers without a college degree, women, ethnic minorities, and younger workers. And this is in part based on their analysis that the effect has been there's going to be more technology applied in a number of areas,
and some significant changes in parts of the economy where people were working in close proximity to each other. That's leisure and travel, retail, hospitality, computer-based work where everybody was working on the same floor without any walls around each other, and then indoor production and warehousing. And part of it is because they think virtual work is going to continue, e-commerce is going to continue to expand, and there's going to be additional automation and artificial intelligence deployed in those areas where people used to work together very intensely. And the impact of that really is that businesses are going to be forced to keep reimagining where and how they do the work. And they're going to have to look at more seriously, how are they going to reskill their workers? They're going to need more flexible and adaptable and short-term training. They're going to need different kind of attention to skills-based credentials that can be more transparent, more widely recognized, and more stackable. And that means also that public authorities have to invest more in digital infrastructure. As is widely known, there are big chunks of the population in all three countries that still don't have access to digital infrastructure. And a lot of the potential workers don't really have the digital skills. So there's going to have to be better programs supporting workers that need to shift occupations and be retrained. There need to be new portable benefits that can be developed for workers and revision of those certification requirements. So, we really think that if the US, Canada, and Mexico could start talking to each other, and we also suggest a trinational committee that could get together and start looking at this, and actually a series of groups that would look at all these different areas that we mentioned, that it could make a big difference. And that in that sense, that we should really be thinking about not just the Build Back Better that Joe Biden talked about, but to build North America back better perspective, looking at all that needs to be done. And just to wrap up, I'll mention a couple of things that we thought of that really coming out of this pandemic experience that should be built upon. One is to take advantage of all the work that's been done virtually. Why not expand across the three countries virtual workforces? And that means tackling what Laura mentioned about the barriers that exist right now to doing that. Why not build on the successful examples that have emerged during the pandemic of virtual education? And that means taking down some of those barriers between the three countries. And then we suggest that we should really look at some of the other focuses coming out of this, the importance of the vehicle sector, new technologies going into vehicles, new technologies in green production. Why not look at those emerging important sectors and see what can be learned coming out of the pandemic to be smarter about doing that? And the same thing with more resilient supply chains and the expansion of e-commerce and the involvement of small and medium enterprises in this commerce across North America. There's a lot that could be done looking at these priority areas to sort of pilot some very creative workforce development programs. So let me stop there. Thank you.
Well, thank you, Tony. And I appreciate the fact that not only did you give me a very excellent comprehensive presentation, you asked and answered your own first question. So there's really some efficiencies gaining on your end as well. But that does give me, your comments give me a bit of an opportunity to plug some of the research that I've been doing and work that we've been doing in my organization. Is we know that the high-tech sector is just tapped out in terms of getting workers with the right skills, the right abilities into the right jobs. And it's not just the high-tech sector, it's, as you say, it's the auto sector, the agricultural sector, but you need these high-tech skills. And so we are really looking at the fact of kind of reinventing our notion of what we mean by a tech worker, that it doesn't have to be a young person, usually male, who's got a 4-year degree. Even an old person like me who's good with a phone can get a tech job. But more importantly, we're looking at how you can reskill people who have been displaced from traditional manufacturing or agriculture. And from talking to experts, what you really need is a desire to learn, a curiosity, an aptitude. If you've got a mechanical aptitude, you can definitely transition to tech. As you mentioned, Tony, broadband, good infrastructure, willing employers who are willing to consider new configurations of how to do things. And some of the programs that we're offering, we've got one called Restart. You can look that up. We're working with communities who have been traditionally overlooked, folks who haven't completed school, who are in low income or difficult areas, and offering not just the skills and certification, but the actual social supports, how to do a job interview, how to work with a team, time management, etc. And it's these soft skills that are every bit as important as learning how to code, etc. But I've taken up enough time with my own commercial here, and I see that there's my friend Andrew Seeley. Hey, Andrew, you have you have had some of the most difficult and challenging issues in your area of expertise. Well, so, over many years, but certainly over the past 2 years, we have been captivated by the challenges of movement of people through the Americas, particularly from Central America, northward, managing those issues. And I know that my prior speakers, we focus more on higher skill, higher tech, higher wage levels, etc. But it's the continuum, the spectrum of the whole community, regardless of wage levels and skill levels, that we have to be paying attention to. So, Andrew, tell me a little bit about your findings with this, with your chapter, but also if you want to brief us a little bit on what you see happening with movement of people through the Americas, across the border. How are we doing, and what can we be doing better?
Great, Laura. First of all, great to see you. I miss our lunches together at the Wilson Center where we could talk about all of these issues in person, which we used to do a lot. And Tony Wayne, Ambassador Wayne, great to see you. Also miss our lunches at the Wilson Center. And Fernando, even though we haven't had a chance to speak, I used to live next to CETIS in Tijuana for many years. So I have been by. I know many people that have graduated from CETIS. It's a great school, and have driven by a million times. So great to see you. And of course, Chris, thanks for putting all this together, my good friend, and Alan Burson and Chap, great to see you as well. And lots of friends here, and colleagues, people I've worked with through the years. Yes, this is a tough issue. I mean, migration is our understanding of migration, the way most of us think of it, and this may not be true for the 20-somethings who are listening to this, but for those of us who are on this panel, our thinking about migration has been framed by Mexicans moving to the United States, right? This was the largest, one of the largest migrations in the world, Mexicans moving to the United States. It's all imprinted on our brain as the way things are. It was a centerpiece of discussions, when Tony Wayne was still the assistant secretary before he was ambassador. This was still part of, assistant secretary for economic affairs. This was still the early 2000s. This was still the way the world worked, right? I mean, when Mexicans and Americans sat down to talk, they were talking migration, and that was all about Mexicans coming across the border of the US. The world we live in has changed. There are still Mexicans coming to the United States, but the vast majority are coming through legal channels, through family reunification, through seasonal visas, through TN professional visas. We've seen in the last year, and really in the last 6 months, a little more than that now, but the last 8 to 9 months, a little bit of an increase in unauthorized migration for Mexican men primarily, which I think may be a figure of the moment and not a long-term change, but we have to monitor that and see what happens. But overall, at least until, through 2019, we had actually seen not only a drop in unauthorized migration for Mexico and a real channeling of migration into legal channels, but we'd actually seen a drop in the number of Mexicans living in the United States. So from 2010 to 2019, the number of Mexican-born people in the United States dropped from 11.7 to 10.9 million. Now, that doesn't sound like much. That's not a huge drop, but if you grant the fact that there are a lot of people moving every year from Mexico to the United States through family reunification, others on TN visas, depending how they get counted or not, about 250,000 Mexicans coming on seasonal visas. Even with all that, the numbers were going down, which says a lot of Mexicans were returning to the United States. And it turns out there were a lot of Americans moving to Mexico as well. So now a large community of Americans living in Mexico, some of whom are children of Mexican citizens, but many of whom are simply there because of business reasons, personal reasons. Walk into, when COVID is less of an issue, walk into any cafe in the Roma neighborhood in Mexico or Condesa, you will find Americans sitting there on their laptops working remotely. So the new migration has been, this does not mean when Mexican migration to the US slowed down, that doesn't mean migration slowed down in the hemisphere. On the contrary, migration has been the most intense it's been in over 100 years in these moments, in the past 3 or 4 years. The biggest migration is actually not Central Americans heading north to the US. So that is a very intense migration. We'll come to that in a second. But actually Venezuelans moving elsewhere in the hemisphere. Primarily Colombia, Ecuador, Peru, Chile, but also to Mexico, which has about 100,000 Venezuelans, perhaps more. Costa Rica, Trinidad and Tobago, Dominican Republic, and other places. Haitians and Cubans, Nicaraguans moving mostly to Costa Rica, and then Guatemalans, Hondurans, and a few Salvadorans moving northward, sometimes staying in Mexico, sometimes heading to the United States. And in a few cases, in the case of Salvadorans, particularly going to Canada. Smaller numbers, but there's a historical community in Canada. This leaves us in our chapter, and the chapter's with Carlos Heredia, who many of you know. Carlos and I look at, first of all, is there a leadership role for North America when the 3 heads of state of North America get together? Should we be talking about migration in the hemisphere? Clearly we should be talking about migration. Before, it was sort of a tough topic to talk about because it was lopsided, right? This was a topic in which the US and Mexico had different equities than Canada did. That's still somewhat true, but it was about Mexicans moving to the US, and so it was kind of hard to deal with in a trilateral scenario. Now we're not talking about that. We're talking about people in other countries in the region. Should there be a conversation about regional leadership, about North American leadership, vis-a-vis all of the migration movements in the region? And I would say there's reasons to think about it. Canada has been a huge leader on Venezuelan refugees. Mexico has one of the largest communities, certainly outside of South America, it's the largest community. And the United States has a substantial, in Latin America, the United States has a substantial community. We should probably talk about that. And we should certainly be talking about Central American migration. And what Carlos and I suggest in this article is on Central American migration in particular, there's an opportunity to think about 4 things. One that we know that will be talked about, which is enforcement. How do you do enforcement? How do you coordinate cooperation around borders? 2, we talk about legal pathways. The reality is, as a Guatemalan colleague told me the other day, there are 5 times as many Guatemalans who go every year as seasonal workers to Canada than go to the United States. That's crazy, by the way. That should not be the case, but that is the case. And so I think the question is, can we begin to think of labor mobility since Canada is invested in this? We say, well, Canada doesn't have much to do with this. Yeah, Canada doesn't have the same political capital in this, right? There is not huge questions that are, affecting the body politic in Canada. But Canada is in fact already quite engaged, both with Mexican and Guatemalan and increasingly Honduran seasonal workers. And so there's a real opportunity. The US also has seasonal worker programs, which have not extended very much to Central America. They're very much in Mexico, 250,000 Mexicans a year, about 5,000 to 8,000 Central Americans. So huge question about how do you begin to increase the number of Central Americans in US seasonal worker programs, and how do you do it in a way that's transparent and accountable? And Mexico has been actually quite generous in receiving Central Americans as well. And my colleagues, Ariel Ruiz and Andrea Tanco, are about to publish something on this. Mexico is an immigrant society, but Mexico is increasing an immigrant society, and Mexico has a lot of regional migration, circular migration, seasonal migration with Guatemala, particularly in the border region. But in fact, because Mexico it has become a default country for many Central Americans, it is increasing a place where many Central Americans go, at least for periods of time, to work. Secondly, or third rather, there's a huge question around protection. Mexico has really picked up, and to some extent, Costa Rica has picked up asylum in the vacuum left by the US, which gutted its asylum system at the border. And so Mexico, probably get around 80,000 if current pace continues, about 80,000 asylum applications this year, majority from Central Americans. Clearly a huge conversation that could be had between Canada, Mexico, and the United States about how to do protection better, how to create in-country protection systems in Central America, how to use the refugee resettlement regime much better among the 3 countries, and how to support Mexico's efforts, and also what the US needs to do. But Canada has great expertise on this. And finally, our last point, and with this I'll conclude, there's an opportunity to think about development in Central America. And clearly, you know, we've heard Joe Biden say he's going to pledge $4 billion. You know, the Biden administration wants to do systemic change in Central America. The Mexican government wants to plant trees. These are different visions about what should be done. But there is, I think, a point, there is a meeting point that is interesting, which is the essence of what the Mexican government wants to do is things that are not complicated. They want to do things that reach people directly and employ people in Central America. The US wants to do systemic change, but the US government also knows they have to do some people that reach people in a much more direct way in Central America. I mean, yes, you can do rule of law, you can do governance, but at some point you also have to do things that employ people and actually create opportunities to anchor people in their country of origin so that they stay. And so I think there is a meeting of minds. And I would argue, and with this I'll end, having Canada at the table in these conversations, yes, the political debate is in the US and Mexico, but having Canada at the table to talk about development is really good for Mexico and the US because the Canadians do development well, they're thoughtful, they can bridge the differences. I often think that when Mexico and the US sit down, when government officials sit down to talk about migration, it is immensely transactional. When they're in the room with Canadians, they start to think more strategically. And these are a set of issues, whether it is development or protection or labor mobility, where Canada has enormous expertise, where the Canadian government is willing to step up, where there's enormous support in Canadian society, and where a trilateral conversation about what to do with Central America, but also what to do with the hemisphere at large would be incredibly helpful and would provide enormous leadership going forward and probably take us out of some of our reactive nature on the set of issues that we have, where we sort of deal with every border crisis as a new occurrence. And instead we begin to give some order and some regularity to migration flows and migration patterns and migration reception within the Americas. Thank you, Laura.
Thank you. You brought up the issue of Canada, and I want to say, sort of on behalf of 34 million Canadians, thank you for bringing that up. I think Canadians have really wanted to be involved in the larger conversation and provide some hands-on assistance. They are very committed to the hemisphere. But as long as the focus is just on, 100 miles north and south of the US-Mexico border, it becomes very hard for Canadians to be involved. And I think you pointed out some very important areas, work on temporary workers, leadership on Venezuela. I want to go back actually to one of your earlier points about circular migration, because that's something I've been interested in for a long time. And it's related to what we were just speaking about, is working in one place, studying in another, living in another, that your citizenship and your employment and your education can be successfully disaggregated. In the communities that you're working with, what would you say the key conditions are that are necessary for successful circular migration? What do people need in order to work where the jobs are, live where their family is and where they want to live, and to not run afoul of the regulations and authorities?
Laura, do you mind if I just jump in with a quick announcement for everyone? I just wanted, since you're on the iPhone, help out with the Q&A part and just let everyone know that you could send your questions to via email to the mexico@wilsoncenter.org. Or through Twitter to @Mexico Institute or @Canada Institute. And then I'll pop back on in a few minutes and relay some of those questions to you, Laura.
That is perfect. Thank you, Chris. And I noticed that we've lost Tony, but I hope that he pops back on as well. So back to you, Andrew.
The whole debate on circular migration and really creating mobility within North America has been held up by the perception that the border between US and Mexico is not under control, right? I mean, we could get much further in a Canadian-US conversation today. Indeed, we have. I mean, the TN visa between Canada and the US, the way it's applied in the US, and I can't remember how it's applied in Canada, but it's similar. I mean, is very agile, is simple, it does not lead to a path to permanence, but it is it creates a real circularity. We've not necessarily addressed the other issues, but let's say we've got the first step. We don't have that same relationship between the US and Mexico, or even Canada and Mexico. And the fear is there because of the difference in average wages and economic levels, economic development level, is that if it's too easy to move back and forth, there'll be too many Mexicans who stay in the United States or Canada, right? I mean, that's the big fear. For a long time, we thought that this might be a solvable problem. I mean, that in essence, what we were seeing was, in fact, very few Mexicans trying to go unauthorized to the US, very few overstaying visas in Canada. Yes, there are some, but it was going down steadily in the number of people. I think the Central American, the rise of Central American and other migration to the US-Mexico border has probably set back that possibility, right? Because Americans don't distinguish very well whether Honduras is in Mexico or a separate country, right? I mean, that's, unfortunately for our body politic, it creates confusion that is not helpful. So I feel like we've sort of stepped backwards in the past 3 years in ways that probably are going to make this a difficult conversation. That doesn't mean we shouldn't be planning for it, however, right? I mean, because I think this is, what's going on right now, Central American flows, is solvable, right? If we create legal pathways for people and protection pathways, it is actually solvable, right? I mean, unlike it, and even more solvable than at some point when we were talking about large numbers of Mexican unauthorized migration. Mexico is a very large country next door to the US. Central American countries are, if we're talking Honduras, Guatemala, and El Salvador, about 33 million people, much further away. You can actually manage migration in intelligent ways that begin to allow people to come through legal channels and discourage people from coming unauthorized. There are ways of doing this. It's not impossible to do. We should do it. I think if we can then get back to the conversation, the question begins, how do we begin to think this fits into the economic policy of the three countries? And I'm not sure we've had that conversation at a national level in any of the countries yet. Canada is the only one of the three where I see a conversation going on immigration as part of economic development, as part of the economic future of the country. And the Canadians always look at immigration numbers and immigration policy as part of economic development. I think that's great. We have not seen that yet in the US. I thought we might see it with the Biden administration, but a conversation about in the context of the recovery, how do we look at immigration, whether it is DACA or it is future flows in the high-tech sector? How do we begin thinking about this as part of the US economic future? In which case it would be really easy to start saying, and Canada and Mexico should be the first, pieces of this, right? I mean, but we haven't had that conversation. And I'm afraid in Mexico, when you say migration again, there are voices saying that Mexico should be thinking about migration as one of its development strategies. But I think that's been overwhelmed by the politics with the US around Central American flows. So I think we're a ways off, but it is not impossible to get there. But it probably takes a couple first steps. One is the perception of control of the US-Mexico border and alternative pathways. And two, the beginnings of real economic conversations that involve migration and human capital, in each of the countries, and then beginning to connect the dots. And we got to get the leaders together. I mean, I'm sure someone said this before I got on, but we don't know yet when the first North American Leaders Conference is. It would be really good. It would be a focusing event if we knew, even if it was going to be video. I mean, they really are going to need to sit down in person, but even if the first one's by video, at least beginning to start the tradition again would be great.
Yes, absolutely. Fernando, you've been waiting patiently. Tony, you went away and you came back, and we're so glad to see you again. I want to go to the question of credentialing and recognition and accreditation. I want to start with Fernando. You are, CETIS is one of the few universities that have actually made the extra effort to get your programs recognized and credentialed in the United States. Why is this important? And if it's important, why aren't more organizations doing this?
Well, I think that the notion of accreditation or recognition of equivalencies was something that was on the table since NAFTA came into fruition. However, the approach that each of the countries took was very self-centered, in the sense that in the US, what matters is institutional accreditation. In the end, is your institution accredited? And that's the driver. Financial aid, many things. In the case of Canada, of course, it's the provinces that really recognize, I learned that some time ago, it's the provinces who really call the shots in terms of which institutions are recognized or not. And it's more program accreditation as such. In the case of Mexico, it has its own. So I think up until now, the issue of recognition has been left to the individual institutions trying to collaborate with each other. And a few institutions in Mexico, a few in Canada, and a few from the rest of the world. Still, there are only about 50 or so from outside the US that have US accreditation. Although none of the institutions are obliged to do so, we do understand that it is the golden standard worldwide. So until further notice, until we can get on the same table, get on the same wavelength, and discuss how it is that with certain characteristics, a Mexican degree is equivalent to a US degree, is equivalent to a Canadian degree, and vice versa, one of the conduits has been that. So in our case, the burden of proof was on us. We wanted our graduates to be competitive. Therefore, the conduit was US accreditation. And so along with 4 other institutions in Mexico that have accreditation, Monterrey Tech, University of Monterrey, University of the Americas Puebla, University of the Americas in Mexico City, and CETIS, we're the only 5 that have accreditation in the US. There are 2 others, by the way, whose names I cannot mention, but are going through the process. But then you also have, I think, 3 or 4, primarily on the western end of Canada, that also have US accreditation. So while there has been conversation, it has been more parochial in the sense of this is what I have. And so nobody's going to tell me, how it is that I should go ahead. And it has been left to the individual institutions up until now. The issue of certification entails a different arena where Ambassador Wayne will probably have a lot more to say, but I think the pandemic has put on the table this possibility that many institutions right now are looking at. Okay.
Great, thank you. And I'm just going to go right over to Tony to sort of pick up that thread from accreditation at the university and college level, but the broader issue of recognition of credentials, mutual recognition of credentials. How are we doing with that? Why aren't we doing better? Is there a role for maybe trilateral organizations or industry organizations to push that along? What's your sense?
Well, my sense is that we're fragmented in all aspects of credentials. And that goes from the university credentialing, even high school credentialing, through the different apprenticeship programs, the different certificates that you get. Within the United States, there's a lot of division. Within Canada, there's division. There is a system in Mexico, but it's not a very well-developed system. So you have a lot of limitations there. So there are some private sector initiatives like Credential Engine that's actually trying to categorize every kind of credential you can get from universities, junior colleges, apprenticeship, training programs, and describe them and have a common set of terms so you can at least understand what the different credentials mean and maybe what stands behind them. But this is going to be a long effort. And that's why one of the work areas that we are proposing is to start having a trilateral working group on specifically these questions. And it will probably be a big group, and then we'll break up into different parts of the work field to try and see if you can get people together. And it runs into a lot of opposition because, as Fernando knows, in the United States, there were rival academic associations covering different parts of the country and different universities. There are different unions in the United States and in Canada that give certain certifications, but not others. There are some certifications that have a fair amount of recognition, but they're not national in the United States, or there's a little bit of Canada, US recognition and some in Mexico in a couple cases, but only limited. So there's a lot of work to do, and that's why we really need to get people together. And that means, in part, I really think that we need national level support for getting these dialogues going. And even if we get them going, it's going to take a number of years to start building up. And that's why one of the key things, I think, is to find some really good pilots where programs are already working, and then see if you can scale those pilots up across North America in different limited ways, and hopefully they will inspire others and they will then grow.
Are there any pilots you can, or any sectors that you can point to that are doing particularly well? Tony, you or Fernando, any good examples we could look to?
There are not any good examples in sectors. There are regional examples that have some really good collaboration going on. A lot of times built around key partnerships between big companies, local officials, and local academic institutions. And there are 5 or 6 of those in the United States. There's Querétaro, and I think Puebla in Mexico, and then a bit up where Fernando is, also in the Tijuana, San Diego region. Then there's a big, I think there's an area in Ontario. There's a couple good examples in Southern Ontario that have brought together universities and big companies there and local authorities to do this. But there, as far as I'm aware, these are all regionally located, and it's because they've built up good partnerships, and that's what you really need, are especially for work skills, are local authorities, local education institutions, and local companies all talking and working with each other.
Fernando, did you want to add some examples? Go ahead.
Yes, no, what I wanted to comment is the following, that there are certainly some potential conduits that could be used to pilot what Ambassador Wayne says. For example, although it is based in the US, you do have ABIT, which would speak of more concrete learning outcomes, skills, etc. And you do have institutions in Canada and institutions in Mexico that have gone through ABIT accreditation. And the collaboration between the institutions is just fantastic. Why? There's a common measure. So it could be that one of the things I was going to say, if we begin to explore arenas where there is already something concrete, at least at a bilateral level, just add the partner that's missing and make it trilateral. So, you know, ABIT would be one of the cases. And then the other thing that could favor Ambassador Wayne things in the future, up until recently, the institutional accrediting agencies could not get together to talk to each other and say, how are we going to collaborate or divide the rest of the world that wants US accreditation? Now, as you know, it's opened up. Any of the 6 can be national. So it seems like we're moving in a different direction where hopefully the opportunity will be there so that there can be a discussion, a substantive discussion, at the very least with those that exist. In the case of Mexico, you have FIMPES, which is very much structured like SACS and WAS. Of course, in the case of Canada, you have to go to each of the provinces, but that's okay. There are few provinces, so you can bring them all together. You're kind
of down on those provinces, Fernando. Go ahead, Tony.
I was just going to say, that's why this is an opportune moment. Everybody suffered during the pandemic, right? And they've experimented and they've learned. So this is a good moment to start building on that sort of really difficult experience and say, okay, where do we go? Let's go together. Let's have a dialogue. Let's get this moving. It's sort of shaken up thinking.
And I wanted to add, there's another important partner in the skilling and upskilling and lifelong learning project, and that is the role of industry. And lots of industry organizations and companies, including mine, have certification programs that they are delighted to offer because it builds better folks for our industries. But also, as Tony mentioned, state and local governments are key. And we've got a couple of programs where we worked with the state and local governments and an external training organization to provide the skills to displaced workers and then go ahead and work for state of Virginia, state of Utah, on some of their cloud requirements within the state government. So it's a really nice mutually reinforcing flywheel. But at the same time, I don't want to discount the important role of universities and colleges in that bigger process. And I know, Chris Wilson, you have a couple of questions, perhaps one for Andrew Seeley. So Chris, do you want to jump in?
Sure. I'm gonna actually combine sort of two questions here. One directly from audience, which is how did the Biden administration manage to get itself into the current mess at the border, and what can it do to get out? And sort of another piece of that was asked is there a role for collaboration with Canada, but North America more broadly? Obviously, Mexico plays a role in solving sort of this current iteration of at least the political side of the crisis, the actual side of the crisis of migration that's facing the administration right now.
Political mess at the border. Go ahead, Andrew, fix it.
Some of this was predictable. I wrote an article back in October, November saying a border crisis is coming. Here's how to prevent it. And I look incredibly prescient right now. I mean, I'm the man who could foresee this, except that title was put there by the editors of America's Quarterly and not by me. So I have gotten people say, "Oh, your article, you were really right on." So I never actually quite said that, but that was the editors being, a little bit provocative on it. Although we were saying there was likely to something happen. Some of this was predictable. Look, I mean, this was a rough year in Central America and a rough year in Mexico. 8-9% contraction of GDP. In Central America, very similar. Remittances did a fairly good job of buffering this for some families, but that tends to be lower middle class and the higher end of low income families, right? So I mean, remittances actually kept up pace or very close in most countries, or increased, or went down very slightly. But generally speaking, we're counter cyclical in most countries. But it was a rough year. I mean, this was a rough year for people who lost jobs, who were in the lower middle class and moved back into poverty. People moved from poverty into extreme poverty. And then you have two hurricanes that hit, Honduras, Guatemala, and Nicaragua. And, I mean, it was a bad year, which had all sorts of effects on agriculture, on crops, as well as on physical infrastructure and so on. So you could see that why people would come in large numbers. And then they were immobile for a year also, right? So a lot of pent up demand, more demand than usual. And then I think there's some decision points, and they're both Mexico and US decision points. I mean, the Mexican government's decision not to take back families in Tamaulipas means that now 90% of the families that are coming across the border and being admitted into the United States are coming across in Tamaulipas and a little bit in Coahuila as well, but basically in South Texas. Because that's it got to a point where the two governments could no longer manage their decision to return people to Mexico. That became a place that people know they can get across. The US government has decided to take in all unaccompanied minors. So not surprising, there's a huge surge in unaccompanied minors. They've also decided that they can't, without an asylum system, without deporting people back to their countries, there's nothing they can do with non-nationals of Central America and the US. And there's actually a very large number, about 19% of the encounters at the border last month were actually non-Central Americans and non-Mexicans. So Venezuelans, Brazilians, Ecuadorians, Indians, Cubans, Haitians, others that are coming across. Some of those people were there already trying to get across, but a lot of them are also discovering that if you come now and you go to the right place at the border, you're going to be let in. So policy choices, some of this was going to happen anyway, and then there were a set of policy choices. But the larger question is really, we do not have legal channels to allow people to come. We know people are going to be wanting to come from Central America for another decade or 2 decades. We knew this with Mexico. It turns out we've now created legal pathways with Mexico, both the number of people, not intentionally, but the number of people who can petition for family members who are legally present in the US can petition for family members is now significant. And the number of people who are recruited in H-2A, H-2B programs is really significant, 250,000, give or take a year. Right. So there are legal pathways for Mexicans. We have not done that with Central Americans. We should start figuring out how to do that now, because, if anything, we should have learned from the Mexican example is if you give people a legal alternative, they're more likely to take it than taking a dangerous journey that's very expensive and very risky. and unauthorized. And so let's create some of the, not an opportunity for everyone who wants to come, but let's create a line that people can get into. And let's create protection mechanisms, because we know in Central America, there's also people leaving because of circumstances tied to extreme violence. Let's also make sure we have some of those protection mechanisms that allow people not to migrate, first instance, but if they have to migrate, do so in a way that's orderly, organized, and we can channel it also through legal protection mechanisms. So that's my answer. I mean, does Canada have a role here? Yes, huge. I think Canada's role, look, it is not a pressing issue. I mean, if the US and Mexico do not ask Canada to join the conversation, Canada has to sit on the sidelines and do sort of, Canada already takes in some people from Central America and certainly from Venezuelans and others. So Canada will keep doing things. They'll have their own development programs in Central America, but Canada can't really become part of the conversation, can't sort of, push that door open if the US and Mexico don't invite Canada in. But this is one where it is in the US and Mexican interest to invite Canada in. It just really is. This is one where making common cause on what to do specifically with Central America, because those are still the big numbers, but also the other flows coming in would just make eminent sense for the reasons I said. I mean, labor mobility, protection, development, all things Canada knows well. Frankly, even on enforcement, where I think there'd be a lot more trust with Canadians working with Guatemala, say, on enforcement than the US in some cases. So I mean, I think that might actually be more palatable. So I think there's a lot of ways that it makes sense, and hopefully the US will think of that is a smart thing to do, and Mexico as well, but certainly the US next door. And that sooner rather than later, there should be a North American Leadership Conference. And hopefully, by the way, talking about migration and labor mobility with other people leads us back to the conversation of labor mobility among the three countries of North America, right? And all of these questions of credentialing and workforce development, and how do people have a portable identity that allows them to move across North America?
Great, thank you. And tomorrow we'll be talking with the Future Borders Coalition. Oh, there's Ambassador Shapiro walking through through to open my window. Anyway. Oh, okay. Testing our alarm system. I think we're just about done. Ambassador Wayne, Fernando, can I get your call to action to policymakers and thought leaders? And I'm going to turn off my mic now because you can hear my alarm.
Okay. Well, first, I want to express my thanks to Chris Wilson, who's worked tirelessly to bring this project to fruition and is going to be working tirelessly on the other chapters as we go forward. He's worked closely with Alan Burson, but he's been doing the really tough work of getting all of our work in order and ready to present to the public. So thank you, Chris Wilson, for doing that. I think the call to action is really taking advantage of this moment. I agree fully with Andrew about having a North American Leaders Summit. That's going to help focus minds. And it's a moment we should do that. We should be looking at all of these issues that are really important for all three of the countries and starting to take them forward. I mean, we have the USMCA framework for looking at purely trade issues, and to start us looking at issues that will make us more competitive. But we have to go way beyond that. It's not the trade ministers are going to solve this stuff. It's all the different ministers working together, and the leaders have to set them at work to do that, whether it's the borders, whether it's that extended security space, whether it's educating our young people better and then helping to re-educate our workers to meet the changes of technology that are going to keep coming. It's not going to stop because the pandemic, we're getting out of the pandemic. It's just going to get faster and faster, I think, the technological changes. And that means we're going to have real lifetime learning in rapid order. And that means we're going to have to change our schools, our businesses, the way our governments support all of this going on for years and years and years into the future. So this is really, and this is the time, as we said, to start that process, because we've all had to rethink a bit the process. Fernando, over to you.
Thank you. Again, thank you to Alan Burstein and Chris Wilson, Laura, for your facilitation. Just two thoughts in addition to what Ambassador Wayne said. One is we've learned, and we should acknowledge and celebrate the differences that are distinctive for the US, for Canada, and for Mexico. But by all means, let's recognize and work on the potential synergies that make North America unique. Thank you.
Thank you. You were so efficient. I didn't know what to do. Thank you, panelists. It was great spending time with you today. I learned a lot. I hope our participants did too. Thank you for your great work and your great ideas and your commitment to the relationship. Andrew Redman, the new director of the Mexico Institute, over to you.
Thanks, Laura. I'd like to thank Harvard's Belfer Center, the Aspen Institute Mexico, our authors and moderators today for a great conversation, and my colleagues in the Canada and Mexico Institutes for the hard work that made today's discussion possible. And as many have said before, we really owe a debt of gratitude to Chris Wilson and Alan Burson for shepherding this project over the past several months. North America, as all of you know, and as we've seen again today, is so much more than a free trade agreement. And I won't recite the litany of cliches about the region or try to invent a new one, but I'll just take a couple moments to try to summarize today's really thoughtful and provocative discussion of some of the many issues on which greater North American collaboration is desirable, if not essential. First, and quoting Rich Sanders from the very beginning of this afternoon, there's a great density of relationships across North America and at all levels, but what we lack is the overarching structures and leadership at the highest levels, such as through the North American Leaders Summit, which has come up a number of times this afternoon. Despite the long history of cooperation and engagement that we have across the region, we clearly need more cooperation on a range of issues, including those discussed today. Second, the threat posed by and the need to address cybersecurity. Cyber is borderless, which brings great benefits, especially during this pandemic when movement was limited, but it also creates a lot of threats. Power grid and regional defense were two that were cited today, but there are so many others where the threat to cyber is really significant, given our dependence and the increasing growth of the Internet of Things and the integration of our economies. Third is the need for harmonization of regulations. Trusted trader programs and credentialing and certification came up today, but there are so many other areas where we really need to harmonize and address these efficiently, and that will require communication between the public and private sectors. And fourth and finally, we clearly need a conversation on migration and labor mobility that involves all three countries, as Andrew Seeley so eloquently described. Thank you all again for joining us this afternoon. Just a final reminder that the papers discussed today are all available on our website, wilsoncenter.org, under the North America tag, or by clicking on the link found on the event page for today's program. Thank you all again for joining us, and take care.